E-Learning Jamaica Limited, in association with the Ministry of Education and Czec Jamaica Limited, present a series of e-learning videos geared towards preparing students for CXC examinations. This series focuses on biology. There are 10 videos, each lasting 20 minutes. Your narrator, Michael Anthony Cuff.
Part 1 covers living things and the environment. At the end of this section, you should be able to identify and describe feeding relationships within a community. Let's explore the feeding relationships further and in more detail. Feeding, or nutrition, is one of the characteristics of living things. The main reason humans and other animals feed is to obtain nutrients. These nutrients provide energy and repair worn-out tissues. What do you think would happen if all animals competed for the same food sources? Yes, you are correct if you said the food supply would become depleted in a short time, and large numbers of animals would die from hunger. Usually, different types of organisms live in the same environment. A group of organisms of the same species living together in a particular environment is called a population. For example, in a log, there may be red ant population or a millipede population. Different populations living together make up a community. Some populations in a community have a close, permanent feeding relationship with one another. The predator-prey relationship is the most common feeding relationship within a community. Predator is an animal that captures and eats other animals. The animal eaten by the predator is called its prey. A tiger and a cat are called predators, while the rabbit and the bird are preys. Remember, the predator eats the prey. Living organisms need energy to survive, move around, and do work. Each population within a community needs energy. They get this energy by the process of respiration, which breaks down the food they eat. The source of all this energy is sunlight. Plants get their energy from sunlight. How do plants use this sunlight energy to make food? The leaves are the main food factory for the plant. They have a mechanism for making their own food. Leaves have special cells which contain chloroplasts. Chloroplast contains the pigment chlorophyll, which allows plants to trap the energy in sunlight and convert this light into useful energy so that plants can use it to make food. Plants use this trapped energy to mix or combine carbon dioxide and water to form food. The carbon dioxide is obtained from the air and enters the leaves through tiny holes called stomata. The water is absorbed from the soil through their roots. The process by which plants make their food is called photosynthesis. The food made is called glucose. Glucose can be converted into different substances such as sucrose, which can be found in sugarcane and sweet fruits, starch, which can be found in wheat, oils, which can be found in peanuts, coconuts, and almonds, and proteins, which can be found in peas and beans. These foods have the sun's energy trapped in them in the form of chemical energy. Because plants make their own food, they are called primary producers. Primary producers are organisms that make their own food. All communities need to eat producers to get energy. Living things that eat other living things for food are called consumers. Consumers do not make their own food, but get their food from a variety of sources. Consumers are divided into three groups. These are primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. Primary consumers are organisms that feed directly on the producers. Primary consumers are herbivores. Herbivores are animals that eat only plants. Here are some examples of primary consumers. We will deal with secondary and tertiary consumers later. Horses, donkeys, goats, cows, rabbits, grasshoppers. A strict human vegetarian would be considered a herbivore. Secondary consumers. Secondary consumers are animals that feed on the primary consumers. They are carnivores. A carnivore is an animal that eats only meat. Here are some examples of secondary consumers: hawk, tiger, crocodile, pelican, lizard. Tertiary consumers are animals that feed on the secondary consumer. They feed on all types of food. Some tertiary consumers are omnivores. An omnivore is an organism that eats both plants and animals. Bears, humans, dog are examples of tertiary consumers. We will use these terms again, so bear them in mind and be ready to use them again. At the end of this section, you should be able to construct typical food energy chains and webs and demonstrate different trophic levels. What are some of the animals you may see when you go outdoors? Write them down. No doubt you may see butterflies, caterpillars, spiders, various types of birds, dogs, cats, rats, lizards, ants, grasshoppers, cockroaches, flies, bees, wasps, beetles, bugs, frogs, snakes, earthworms, millipedes, centipedes, and mongooses. Let us examine the feeding relationship among some of these animals. The grasshopper eats the leaves of the plant. The lizard eats the grasshopper. The bird eats the lizard. The cat eats the bird. Here's another example of saying the same thing. The caterpillar eats the leaves of the plant. The lizard eats the caterpillar. The bird eats the lizard. The mongoose eats the bird. How energy passes from one organism to another can be represented by a food energy chain. For example, in a field community, Grass changes energy from the sun into chemical energy. The grass uses some of this energy for itself and stores the rest. A grasshopper can then eat the grass. The lizard then eats the grasshopper. The lizard is then eaten by the bird, which is later eaten by a cat. Energy from the sun passes through each link of the food chain. Each animal uses some of the energy to stay alive and store some in its tissues. When the animal is eaten, the energy stored in its tissues is passed on. At the end of this section, you should be able to identify the relative positions of producers and consumers in a food chain. Let us look at how energy trapped by plants is utilized by other living things and moves from one organism to another. Do you see that the energy in the plant is being incorporated into the caterpillar? And this energy moves up the chain to lizard, bird, and cat? Do you realize that if the plant dies, then the rest of the food energy chain dies? What changes do you think would happen if there were fewer caterpillars? You're quite right. If you said that if the population of caterpillar falls, then the lizard would have to find other food sources. What is clear is that if any member of the chain is lost, it affects the whole feeding relationship along the chain. Can you now draw another food chain from the list of animals that you have made? Here is one. Which member of this food chain would you consider to be the top predator? Yes, the owl, because it is at the top of the food chain. Notice that these feeding relationships are all over the world. They just include different species of plants and animals interacting to provide food for one another. Food energy chain exists in water, aquatic environments, and on land, terrestrial environments. So far, we have looked at simple feeding relationships between terrestrial, that is, land-based animals. Now, let us look at the feeding relationships between water-based, that is, aquatic animals. The marine environment is very active. Algae or seaweed uses sunlight to make its food and grows on the reefs. The snails eat the vegetation on the reef, the algae. Small fish eat the snails. Larger fish eat the small fish. A large bird like the pelican eats the large fish. The freshwater habitat has its own vibrant food energy chains. Here are 3 examples involving animals with which you are familiar. Note that plants always start the chain, but we must remember that the sun is the universal source of energy, and the plants are just making the sun's energy available to animals. In reality, all animals are dependent on plants to get food. Let us now identify the relative positions of producers and consumers in a food chain and relate feeding positions to their modes of feeding in a pyramid. In nature, food energy chains rarely exist in isolation because organisms usually have more than one source of food. The food energy chains are normally linked to form an interlocking pattern or network of feeding relationships called a food energy web. Let us now extend the food energy chain idea to show how many animals interrelate with one another to form this food energy web. Notice that many food energy chains connect to form a food web. We will now show you a set of food energy web. Write out a food energy chain from each of the food energy web as quickly as you can. For each of the food chain that you wrote, identify the producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and tertiary consumer. Analyze food energy web number 3 and name the organism that is both primary consumer and secondary consumer. Yes, you are correct. The answer is the rat and the small birds. Did you notice that they feed from 2 levels? Both the small bird and the rat eat nuts and grains from plants as well as insects. Consider food web number 3 and answer this question. Mr. James swept up all the dried and rotten leaves in his yard. Examine the energy web and suggest how a reduction in the amount of rotting leaves may lead to a reduction in the number of rats. The number of earthworms will decrease. The beetle population has to eat more moths. Population of moth decreases. Population of small birds decreases because there are fewer moths to eat. The carnivorous mammals have to resort to eating more rats. Let us introduce another idea relating to feeding levels. This idea relates to the word trophic level. Objective: explain the role of decomposers as facilitators of the return of nutrients to the soil. When we examine the carbon and nitrogen cycles, we see that decomposers are very important to the function of the cycle because they feed on dead material and help to recycle nutrients in the community. Decomposers must be represented on the food energy web because they break down and convert complex compounds to simple substances. This process releases nutrients which helps plants to become good primary producers. For example, the callaloo plant needs long, green, fleshy leaves so that it can provide lots of food for the consumer. The decomposers feed on decaying material and free up the nitrogen and make it available to the soil and therefore to the plants. Decomposers are mainly fungi, bacteria, and other animals such as earthworms and millipedes. Thanks to these decomposers, nutrients are freed up and the food energy web is enhanced.